I'm Rob Downey, a family practice MD and Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I'm coming to you from Seaworthy Functional Medicine in Homer, Alaska. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital.
What if we could talk to a functional medicine expert about the genetics of weight and being lean? Today we have that exact good fortune. We are joined by Dr. Sam Shay. And how's it going, Sam?
It's going good. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you.
Too.
Now, typically I abbreviate folks' bio, but in your instance, this is actually pretty cool and pretty important to share this. And I think people are going to find this a really energetic way to start. So I'll do this briefly, and then in your typical fine form, you're going to take us on a grand tour through some really cool concepts.
Grand tour. Okay.
So Dr. Sam Shay, Doctor of Chiropractic and an IFM certified practitioner, solves health puzzles for busy, health-conscious parents, entrepreneurs, and adults on the spectrum so they can exit survival mode and re-enter community by increasing resilience and energy through functional genetics. Oh, there's so much good language in here. Dr. Shay walked his own health journey from being chronically unwell from age 6 to 18, including severe fatigue, anxiety, digestive problems, chronic pain, severe insomnia, sugar addiction, video game addiction, excessive coffee, depression, and poor nutrition. He took control of his health, starting as a teenager, and dedicated his life to natural medicine. Known as the friendly lab nerd, Dr. Shay specializes in functional lab and genetics analysis for data-driven results. Lastly, Dr. Shay is known as Dr. Shay, the stand-up comic who uses comedy as edutainment on his YouTube channel, along with his other functional testing teachings. His primary focus in comedy is to educate the public on what it's like to be on the spectrum, specifically Asperger's. Well, it's really great for you to give us your time and expertise today.
No, thanks. I appreciate being here. It's I'm a clinician by training, but I'm a teacher at heart. And the best way to scale and reduce suffering is by teaching. And I find that podcast summits are the fastest way to help people at scale and to arm people with information, certainly information I never had growing up and that I had to learn the hard way. Going through graduate school being one of those hard ways. It's just the amount of information we have available is just astounding. So I just like to contribute in my own way. I think that, particularly for people like myself who are on the spectrum and we didn't have the resources 20, 30, 40 years ago that are available today. And one of the things that I wanted to share is how to shorten the learning curve that certainly my parents and myself could have had decades ago to make everyone's life a lot easier and more fulfilling and more meaningful. Here in this particular topic, we want to talk about the genetic causes for excess weight, and the reason why that it's important is that weight is actually not necessarily the issue. Weight has multiple causes. There's over 10 we'll identify here today, but weight is more of a downstream effect of some upstream concern. So weight is a proxy. Excess weight is a proxy for bent metabolism, which is going to have long-term meaningful consequences downstream. So when I'm talking weight, I'm not. Weight's just kind of a placeholder for many other things that are manifest and things that could be manifest. So I don't see weight loss as just weight loss. I see it as lifespan, health span extension, and quality of life improvement, not just merely sculpting for aesthetics. Or some vague, or just merely some vague existential threat of, oh, I'm going to be unhealthy in the future. That's a bit vague. I mean, we can really make it much more concrete, especially if you understand the genetic causes. So, from Australia, that genetics contributes to 70% of obesity, and that what we're going to look at is that 70%. and like what are those genetic causes. And the thing about genetics is that I don't look at genes that we are helpless to do anything about. There's a big problem in genetics where there's a bit of a learned helplessness where like, oh, I have this gene, I'm screwed, oh well. And I only focus on genes you can do something about. That you can change their expression, which we call epigenetics, which is a Scrabble word for lifestyle, how you live, how you eat, move, and think, how your internal environment, your external environment converge into picking how your genes actually express themselves, like a dial on a switchboard or something. Like you can have dialed all the way to one side or the other, somewhere in between. Your lifestyle, internal and environment, internal and external, will change where that dial is turned, and that's where we do have control. And just to let people know that I'm not speaking in theoreticals here. Like here's an example of one of my clients that lost 27 pounds in 3 months, as well as he quit drinking, improved his diet, and he also had no more panic attacks. This individual lost 10 pounds, and she viewed it as a real gift to herself. And she was struggling with some other things that also got improved as well. And it's, again, weight is a proxy. Weight is a placeholder for many other things. And my hope is that the message here about genetics is very empowering, that you can actually do stuff about all these other causes of weight in a very practical way. So we're going to cover there's 3 main categories for excessive weight. There's inflammatory water weight, there's hormonal toxic weight, and then there's caloric fat weight. So the first one we'll talk about is the puffy weight or water retention. And for those of you that are watching, this is a list of all the different subcategories of genetic-based reasons why people have certain types of weight. For those that are just listening, just don't worry about it. I'll be walking through it all verbally. So when we're talking about all these different causes of weight, and the 3 main categories: inflammatory water weight, hormonal toxic weight, caloric fat weight, again, we can do something about them because of what's called epigenetics. And there's that dimmer switch analogy I just shared, and the people who've got good and bad versions of these genes, what that means is that if you have the quote unquote bad version of a gene, that means that you have to pay much more attention and have much more scrutiny on your lifestyle in order to make that gene behave in a way that you want. So in genetics, we've had green, yellow, and red dot. So green, air quotes, green dot is you got a good copy of the gene from mom and a good copy from the gene from dad, which means that your gene by default is behaving in the way you want it to. Then you've got the bad copy from mom, bad copy from dad. That's 2 bad copies. That's a red dot. So by default, the gene is misbehaving. And then you've got the yellow dot where you got 1 bad copy from one bad parent, from one parent, 1 good copy from another parent. Doesn't matter which one, because we're not talking about sex-based differences here. We're talking about just doesn't matter from which gender. You got the quote yellow dot, and that means that typically yellow dots are more like they're more like red dots than they are like yellow dots typically. So we treat our yellow dot seriously, not just some, not just, oh, it's in the middle somewhere. It's usually not in the middle somewhere. It's usually more towards the red side. And what this means is that with proper lifestyle, nutrition, diet, etc., your red and yellow dots can, key phrase, behave more green-like. They will never be green, never, unless you're dumb enough to inject CRISPR into your bicep. And there's pictures all over the internet of some dude who did do that, and it looks nuts. So you will never change your red and yellow dot into a green, but you can make it behave like a green dot. And that's what's empowering about this type of genetics, is you can change the expression. Now, the reverse is also true, where if you have a giant buffet of green dots, but you have a terrible lifestyle, your green dot will behave like a yellow and red dot. So just because you have a green dot, you're not out of the woods. And for the people that I have seen that have just a giant buffet of green dots and their health is still not really great, then what's happened is that their poor health is really self-inflicted or is inflicted upon them through their circumstance and environment. And it wasn't because of bad genes that they inherited. And if it's self-inflicted, then that's a very hard conversation to have with someone who is just convinced that, oh, it's my bad genes, that's why I'm like this. It's like, yeah, it's way more, it's way more responsibility. And so that's just a different type of conversation. But ultimately, whether you're green, yellow, red dot, personal responsibility and knowing the right tools and most importantly, what genes to focus on is going to get you the best, quickest, and most long-lasting results. So I'll pause there before I get into kind of the specifics of each individual gene and just any comments or thoughts before I press on.
Thanks so much. Just want our audience to know today's a little different in that the majority of Field Notes podcast episodes are similar in terms of YouTube versus audio. And this particular one, Dr. Shay is sharing images on screen. And so if you're checking this out on the audio platform and you're interested, either replay it on YouTube or just consider checking out the visuals. So thanks.
Okay. So the first cause of water retention, there's the inflammatory water weight genetic cause. And so there's 5 subcategories of genetics that drive water retention, inflammatory or puffy weight. So there's the genes that drive inflammation, the genes that affect how well you absorb vitamin D. There's salt sensitivity genes, there's histamine sensitivity genes, and then there's reactions to food allergen genes. And so all of those, when they go sideways, create inflammatory water weight. And there's a very simple test, and the simple test is something I call the muffin test. The muffin test is that if you to see if you're over-inflammatory, is that if you're over-inflammatory, what this means is that anything you do that's inflammatory will create more inflammation in the body. Now, why is it that inflammation will create all this water weight? It's because the purpose of inflammation is to run in and deal with the problem and then leave. Like acute inflammation is helpful to like clean up the mess, and then it's supposed to leave. The problem is that inflammatory chemicals in the body, they're dangerous. They damage the cells over time. So if you are eating things like a muffin, for example, and you're very pro-inflammatory, your body will swell up with water to dilute the inflammatory chemicals so that they don't hit and damage the cells and tissues. So basically, if you swell up with water, people retain water in order to buy the liver and kidneys time to filter out the inflammatory damaging chemicals. So the muffin test is if you eat half a muffin and that day you put on 1 to 3, maybe 4 pounds. Now, unless that muffin was last year's regifted Christmas fruitcake, it did not weigh 1 to 3 pounds, right? So why did you put on 1 to 3 pounds when it's just this tiny little half muffin? It's because it's the sugars, it's the food colorings, it's the preservatives, it's the dough rising things, whatever the weird plastics leach through, the little wrapper on it, the colorings, whatever it is inflammatory. And so now the body's like, wait, we need to dilute all these inflammatory chemicals so that we don't injure the cells. And so you swell up with water weight. That's the muffin test. Other signs of people who are over-inflammers that they experience an exercise paradox. So the more they exercise, the fatter they get. And the fat is not caloric fat. It's just like water, like their muscle tone gets washed out. It's like this kind of watery layer, and like the skin becomes like this kind of ruddy, reddish, like pocked almost complexion. I did an entire set of lectures at genetics conferences on exercise-induced obesity, and just went through all the genetics of it. And there's people who good exercise is net anti-inflammatory, but people who over-exercise, they can become pro-inflammatory. It kind of overshoots. And then they have the same water retention issues, and that's why their muscles seem washed out and their skin gets kind of this watery, ruddy complexion. So that's how you know if someone, that's an easy way to know if you're an over-inflamer. And then for people that are more kind of on the tech and nerdy side, there are specific genes, like there's 15 major pro-inflammatory genes, and you can look for clusters of these genes. If they have the clusters of red and yellow dots, you can also look at liver detox genes, specifically those that affect estrogen. And if people, like, the liver's primary job is to detox and to deal with inflammation. But if you had to pick one or the other, like if your kitchen is on fire and you have to take the garbage out, what's more important? It's to put the fire out of the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And the liver is the same way. So if you have someone who is both hyper-inflammatory genetically and has problems detoxing, what happens is that if you get over-inflamed, then your liver not only has to deal with the inflammation, but it can't detox properly. So that means is that men who are over-inflamers plus have genes that prevent them from detoxing estrogen, they develop not only inflammatory weight gain, but they develop man boobs because they get an excess of estrogen that builds up and that it redistributes the fat onto their chest. For women, they can have lots of inflammation, and then they get lots of inflammation and they have problems detoxing estrogen. What happens is they get inflammatory weight, but then their cycles go sideways. Mm-hmm. So this happened to one of my clients. This is actually a subject of one of the genetics conference case studies, where she went to CrossFit, and this CrossFit individual, I'm trying to be polite here, put her on an hour a day for like 5-6 days in a row consistently, and she just lost her muscle tone, put on a lot of water weight, and her cycles went completely off, and she started to gain weight and feel terrible. And she contacted me, and when I looked at her genetics, she was hyper-inflammatory and massively estrogen. In fact, massively estrogen dominant in terms of her poor ability to detox is actually what the genes, for people who are watching, I'm showing the genes of hers specifically. And I put her on an anti-inflammatory liver detoxing, remove all exogenous sources of estrogen and reduce the exercise down drastically. Then her inflammatory weight went away, her muscle tone returned, and her cycles normalized. And the answer, most people think, oh, she's overweight, she needs to exercise more. No, that would be the worst thing for her to do. That's what actually got her into the problem in the first place. I'm not saying exercise is bad. I want to be very clear on that. I'm saying over-exercise is bad. So you've got the people who develop water retention from overinflammation. Then you got people who have difficulty absorbing vitamin D. And most people mistakenly think vitamin D is just about bone density. And that's not true. It's not mostly about it. It is a part of it. But vitamin D controls, it's estimated between 3 to 5% of your entire human genome. That's insane. That is like 1/20th to 1/33 of your entire genome is affected by vitamin D. Most of it is about controlling inflammation and your immunity. Bone density is a meaningful part, but it's not the most important part. So there are people who have problems in their vitamin D receptors. This is a gene that they can't absorb. There's getting vitamin D from the sun, supplements, or food into your bloodstream. That's half the battle. But getting it from the bloodstream into your cells is the other half of the battle. And that's what I'm talking about. There's genes that create these docking sites to grab the vitamin D floating in the blood, to pull it into the cells to then activate that 3 to 5% of your genome to help with inflammation, immune control, and yes, bone density. So there are people that, like me, who have red dots in their vitamin D receptors, which means that it's much harder for people like me to control inflammation because I can't absorb vitamin D as well as normal people. So this is, and I found, and this may be particularly useful for you, Dr. Downey, is that I have found in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of genetics tests that I've run, there's a very strong correlation, very strong, that the people with chronic illnesses have double variants in their VDR1 and VDR2 receptors. And I had the chief scientist of the genetics company go back to his other uh, uh, higher volume practitioners and also check the massive database that he has access to. And I said, I think there's a pattern. Would you please go double check this? And he came back to me a couple of months later and says, there's absolutely a pattern. The VDR genes, if they're red dots in particular, very, very high correlation with chronic disease. And so I don't know if you've seen that in your practice, but that was something that just shot out of the data.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment for sure.
Okay. So, so people who have trouble with vitamin D absorption will have more inflammation and therefore more inflammatory weight problems. Then we've got salt sensitivity. Now, most people think that if you've got genetic salt sensitivity, you have a higher risk of blood pressure. And I don't really find that. I find that there's tons of reasons for high blood pressure. Alcohol, stress levels, excess smoking, sleep apnea, thyroid issues, adrenals, kidney issues, etc. But the thing that really I saw that for people who had variants in their red or yellow dots in their salt genes, it was either they had high blood pressure, which I didn't find that often, but they had water retention. It was one or the other, and it was mostly water retention. And she's my permission to. She gave me her permission to talk about this. But one of my interns, she's 27, athlete, master's in functional medicine genetics, was my intern for 2 years. She knew her stuff. But she had this like puffy weight around her belly and in her fingers that she could not get rid of, and she was super frustrated. And when she ran her genetics, she figured out that she had salt and histamine sensitivity. And once she dropped her salt content, she had no high blood pressure to speak of. I mean, that's not even close.
Mm-hmm.
But once she dropped the salt, and we'll talk about histamine next, and her histamines in her diet, the puffy water weight in her belly and her fingers went away. She had otherwise like a perfect lifestyle. And by my definition, I have a very strict definition. And it was genetically, it was salt and histamine that was causing her this frustrating weight. Then you have histamine sensitivity for water retention. Now, histamine, as you know, is that's a whole series of podcasts just talking about histamine. It's a big thing, and I want to. I always try to rely on evolutionary biology to try to explain phenomenon. So why is histamine related to inflammation? So people to understand histamine is the body's emergency switch to deal with venom. It's the emergency flood switch. So if a bee stings your arm, the bee does not inject a half quart of water into your arm that made your arm swell up. That's not a thing. But the bee did inject venom, and then the body said, "Oh wait, really dangerous substance that can corrode or erode tissues, nerves, muscle, and in certain snakes, like bone. Like whether it's a spider, a bee sting, a wasp, a hornet, a snake, a centipede, whatever, scorpion." You've got to do the thing that inflammation does, which is dilute the toxic thing. But in the case of venom, you need to dilute it a lot and fast. So that's what histamine is, the emergency flood switch. We're going to flood this whole area with water quickly to prevent very, very bad things from happening from this injection of venom. And it's the best, it's the only thing that makes any sense to me of like why histamine is this kind of exuberant water response. And so some people have a more exaggerated response than others when it comes to histamine. Now that makes sense if you're in a high venom environment where there's lots of scorpions and snakes and spiders. Like you'd want to have a faster response because you're more likely to get stung. But if you're in a low, but if you're in a low venom environment, like New Zealand, for example, is famous for not having any venomous anything, then you get a genetic advantage to have a low histamine response. Because if people are hypersensitive to things, they can just swell up to anything and potentially jeopardize, their limb, blood supply, or even their breathing. So for people that have a high histamine response, the issue is that if they eat foods, and again, this is a way bigger discussion for like another podcast or 10 on histamine intolerance. There are foods that have high histamine. There are foods that release more histamine in the body, and there's foods that block the breakdown of histamine in the body. So if you are histamine sensitive and you eat these histamine increasing foods, then what you're doing is you're doing the equivalent of consuming a slow-moving full-body bee sting that is in creating water retention globally. And that's why histamine sensitivity creates this water weight, this puffy weight, because you're basically internally generating a bee sting that's then creating this kind of slow-moving flood switch. So that's why histamine, and that's what happened to my intern. She had both the salt and the histamine, which was creating, and also explained why the water weight was more focused around her bellies, because that's where most of the histamine was happening, was in her intestines from her the higher histamine food. Now, some of the foods that are high in histamine are air quotes healthy in other ways. Like you tell a Californian that they can't have avocado, they're going to lose their mind. But avocado is high in histamine. So this is by far, I don't know if this is your experience, but so far it's been the vast majority of all practitioners I've talked to. The single hardest conversation to have diet-wise with any client on average is to put them on a low histamine diet. The negotiation begins within the first 30 seconds of you mentioned, right? Has this been your experience? It's been mine. But
Well, lots and lots of challenges around the things people love and how well or poorly they match with their genetics. Yeah, that's a hard one for sure.
okay. I mean, yeah, the negotiation around chocolate, avocados, and citrus foods have been the hardest things for people to wrap their anyway. So those are the first four main reasons for water weight: inflammation, difficulty absorbing vitamin D, salt sensitivity, histamine. And then there's another one, which is stronger reactions to food allergens. Now, there's 7 major food allergens: fish, eggs, wheat, soy, shellfish, dairy, peanuts, and tree nuts. And people have more genetic vulnerabilities to all food allergens, not necessarily these 7 specifically. But if people have genetic vulnerabilities to food allergies in general, then it's really helpful to put them on an elimination diet. And the food allergy response is kind of similar to a histamine inflammatory response. That's why there's whole diets related to going on elimination diet to drop weight. National bestsellers on literally all they're doing is just putting people on a elimination diet, and people drop the weight. And it's because they're dropping the inflammatory water weight. So those are the 5 causes of the inflammatory water weight. The next one we'll talk about is the toxic hormonal weight. And the main one is alcohol. And alcohol, depending on your country and culture and religion, alcohol is either verboten or it's a sport. And for people like me who have a red dot in alcohol, like I would get extremely sick if I had alcohol. And that is a good thing for health because it keeps me away from it. It is a bad thing depending on the culture, the local culture I hang out with, if it's a drinking culture or not. So there's sacrifices socially, one way or the other. So I'm full disclosure, I'm not a fan of alcohol in any amount. I don't think that I think that there's very fascinating histories around alcohol, and one of which is that sometimes alcohol was the only safe liquid to drink, not because alcohol was safe, it's because the water supply was tainted with pathogens. So people were half drunk all the time simply because they couldn't trust running water, whether it's through a stream or through their house, because it was at risk of E. coli and many other things. So until we had public sanitation and clean water, or rather, I should say, sanitized water, sterile water, rather, people were drinking alcohol. So a lot of people say, well, alcohol is part of our culture. It's like, no, it was part of your healthcare system when we didn't have a better one. So it's not part of the culture because it was part of the culture. It was part of the culture because you would die if you didn't have it available. So I'll kind of end my rant on alcohol, but I'm not a fan, full disclosure. And genetically, there's certain people who should not have it because it's really toxic for them. And if your liver is overwhelmed with alcohol and genetically you can't handle it, then you can't deal with inflammation and you can't deal with detoxing hormones, which then puts on weight because hormones add weight. You know, like these hormones, anabolic hormones that build up your size. So there's people genetically who have problems with liver detox in general, not just specific to alcohol. And the best analogy I was ever given for understanding liver detox, I got from studying with Dr. Kalish for 4 years. And he talked about the washer dryer analogy. So this analogy is totally credited to him. I don't know where he got it, but I just heard it from him. So the liver is a washer dryer system. So if you have clothes, you wash them, and then as soon as they're done washing, you put them in the dryer. Now, if you take dirty clothes and you put them in the washer, but you don't put them in the dryer, they can get mildew and moldy and be worse than if you'd never washed them in the first place. It's the same thing with the liver. If you put a toxin through phase 1 or the washer, it becomes more reactive because in phase 2, the dryer, in the liver, you attach a heavier amino acid onto it, or a larger molecule like glutathione, which is 3 amino acids, to make the toxin like heavy. So then it can be either go into the like bile to then be put into the stool to be pooped out. So you got rid of it. The problem is that if you don't have the dryers ready to catch the wet laundry, then that wet laundry or that wet toxin, so to speak, is now way more dangerous than the toxin itself. The example that I learned in organic chemistry class in 2000, sitting in college, was benzene. That benzene is very dangerous, but the benzene oxide radical, when it goes through phase 1, is over 100 times more dangerous than the benzene itself. So people who have, and this is where you get multiple chemical sensitivities, is that people who have a very hyperactive washer or phase 1, but they have terrible dryers. So they even smell the off-gassing of a paint and they're just spun out. Or they're around some of the perfume and they get sick. It's because whatever they breathe in or whatever they're exposed to automatically goes to the liver. And the liver, instead of getting rid of the toxin, now makes the toxin way, 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 way worse, which is tragic and ironic. Mm-hmm. So dealing with multiple chemical sensitivity clients involves like obviously cleaning up their environmental exposure, but then like really supporting their phase 2, their dryers. Like you support their dryers, you support their mitochondria to make sure there's enough energy to run the dryers, and like you do this whole cascade of things to support the liver detox, especially the dryers. So for people genetically, some people genetically have overactive washers and underactive dryers or some combination, which makes it hard for them to detox. So you can have normal dryers, but if your washers just went bonkers and just like pushing way more than even normal dryers can handle, you're going to have a problem. If you've got normal washers but broken dryers, you're going to have the same problem. And if you've got both overactive washers and broken dryers, then you got a real problem. Mm-hmm. So that's how to best understand the genetics of liver detox. And there's also specific genes as it relates to estrogen and how to, like, are you vulnerable specifically to getting rid of estrogen itself? Then we come to the last category of excess weight, which is caloric weight or fat. Now, this, to me, modern day, this is the least common reason that people are overweight. The most common reason people are overweight is primarily the water inflammatory weight, which is from the inflammation, the vitamin D, the salt, the histamine, strong reaction to food allergens. Secondarily, it's the toxic weight, which we just talked about. And then the third cause is the calorie issue. And not to say that people don't overeat, they do. But I think the foods they're overeating, it's like the muffin. it is the muffin test. Like the muffin test is very half a muffin is not that many calories, but a massive amount of inflammatory triggers.
Mm-hmm.
So genetically, there's a couple causes that why overeating calories would create excess fat weight. So there's number one, the people are eating the wrong number of carbs for their genetics. And today, you can actually genetically determine what your carb tolerance is. Are you keto, Mediterranean, paleo, or high carb? This is a new genetics technology. In fact, it's the only company that does this commercially is actually in Australia, not the States, because this is not looking at this is the only gene I'm going to talk about. It's not talking about red, yellow, and green dot. This is talking about what's called copy number analysis. It's a it's a three-dimensionality to genetics that very few people understand, much less talk about or even do testing for that's clinically practical. So it's looking at the number of duplicates of a gene, not the version of the gene. So the best way to describe this is that if your digestive system is a medieval fort and carbs are charging the fort like the Visigoths, you've got cannons lining the fort to shoot down these Viking equivalents. And it's the number of cannons that matter, not the version of the cannon. So if I've got only 2 cannons versus 9 cannons, I'm going to do a way better job mowing down these carb Vikings than if I've got only 2 cannons. So for me, I'm a 2. I only have 2 copies of this gene that regulates my carb tolerance. So I'm like a very low carb paleo bordering on keto diet. Whereas some people have got 5 to 8 copies of this, and they're more of a Mediterranean style. And people got 9 or more copies, they're more of a high carb. So for people that eat a diet that's not congruent with their genes, they're going to, for example, if I'm a very low carb tolerant person and I eat a lot of carbs, my energy levels are going to shoot up and then crash, and then I'm going to eat more carbs to shoot back up. And so I'm going to overeat calories because my energy levels my metabolism is so fast that I'm just going through this yo-yo of carb energy crashes, and that's going to lead to much more caloric intake into weight. Then you've got the people who've got are genetically vulnerable to caffeine, which creates caffeine-induced anxiety and depression. Now, I don't know if you've ever talked to a whole bunch of room of entrepreneurs, but when I say that, there's a percentage of you in the room that are genetically vulnerable to caffeine-induced anxiety and depression, the whole room clenches because they're so afraid. My caffeine drives my business, But people who have sensitivities to caffeine, like me, they will get anxious and therefore overeat calories to deal with the anxiety that was brought on by caffeine. So that's a hidden genetic, draw a straight line to genetics on that, where people can overeat. Then there's the genetics of people that have low satiety, people who've got, meaning that they have the gene that doesn't signal, that slows the signal from stomach to brain that you're full. So you think you're full. Oh, sorry, you're feeling full is not in the stomach, it's in the brain. And so that signal is slowed down genetically. Then you've got people who genetically crave the taste of sugar. And so if they crave sugar, then they're going to overeat more. Now, why would people be burdened with overeating, with craving the taste of sugar? Well, again, evolutionary biology, if you have this gene, you're going to be foraging extra hard. Now, I actually did a presentation on this on Mother's Day, and I got an email that day on Mother's Day from the natural grocer, the organic shop that's in the area, for come in today and we'll give you a free chocolate bar. Now, when I saw that, I literally watched my own mind go into foraging mode and be like, oh, because I have this gene, like, oh, chocolate, sugar. Like, and as I was literally writing the presentation on craving sugar, I could not stop thinking about that darn chocolate bar they were giving me for free. So all of my foraging circuitry got activated by that stupid email Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's why we'd be cursed with this is because it will actually increase survivability of the lineage if we're more enthusiastic to forage. So there's some genes that we can think, oh, but this is such a curse. It's the genes you think that are a curse may actually be a blessing, just we're not in the right environment. Even the inflammation genes. If I'm an overinflamer, which I am, how is that possibly an advantage? Well, if I'm on a hunting party as a Paleolithic hunter and gatherer, and I'm trying to hunt a giant animal with hooves, claws, horns, teeth, and it's like 10 times my body weight, there's a very high likelihood I'm going to get bit. Now, what is a bite? It's tissue damage with the injection of pathogens from the saliva and the things in its mouth. So what does inflammation do? It rushes into the bite wound with red blood cells to heal and white blood cells to kill the infection. So if I'm hyperinflammatory, which I am, I will likely survive the bite wound better in the short term than my less inflammatory prone hunting party member who got the exact same bite wound. That's the trade-off. Inflammation is a trade-off. I'm just in the wrong environment because I'm not hunting, antelope or whatever, or bears or something. So one of the things, it's a bit meta, but one of the things that running my genetics helped me is I forgave my body. As you read in my bio, I was very ill as a child, and I got gaslit. Both my parents were psychiatrists. I got gaslit. I told everything was in my head and all the rest of it. And when I got my genetics, I actually cried for an hour because I realized why I was so sick. And I also realized that my body was better adapted for a different time. And I also, because of the specific genes I ran, I had an answer of how to deflame, deal with the vitamin D. Like, I had answers also. So it not only gave me a roadmap forward, it gave me an explanation of the past. And that's one of the real gifts of running genetics that I don't think people truly get until they see it. And because it was very hard, to put it lightly, it was very hard to grow up with all of this illness and to be gaslit. And I realized that my body was never against me. It was just equipped for a different time. That's all. Finishing up, there's also some genes that make you want to overconsume sugar, not just the taste of it. And for similar evolutionary biology reasons, like if you want to overconsume more sugar, you will eat more of the fruit trees that are in bloom like once or twice a year for only a couple of days or a couple of weeks. So you'll actually store on more calories to help you survive the inevitable starvation periods. And there's some people that crave more fat in their food because fat is not just a calorie source, it's a flavor and a texture, which then also helps you from a hunter-gatherer perspective. You would eat more fat off of the carcass, therefore you would pack on more calories in order to survive the winter or whatever. Then there are people that genetically have a harder time burning fat for energy and burning fat for heat. And this has to do with, this is genes related to mitochondria and how well you put fat through that to burn it up. So those are the I believe not just 10, I think like 16 genetic reasons for excessive weight. I know it was a bit of a masterclass, just kind of powering through all of this, but I want to impress upon everyone who's listening and watching that if you're struggling with excess weight, you may have a lot of clues that are unlocked from your genetics, and that there may be some strategies that were never presented to you because there wasn't any data pointing to it as a likely cause, like histamine, like salt, like overeating foods to cope with anxiety because you drink coffee every day that causes the anxiety. There's over a dozen reasons genetically why you may be struggling with excess weight, which is, as I said in the beginning, a placeholder for all these other things that are either manifest or will manifest in the future. So my hope is that this although very technically top heavy, can help give people a roadmap and some new avenues to explore of why they may be struggling with excessive weight. And genetics is a huge set of keys used to unlock one's weight. And if people are wanting to know more, they can just go to my website, drsamshay.com, drsamshay.com. I've got ebooks on genetics and functional testing. I've also have, for people, if they want to chat with me individually, I got a free 15-minute application call. They can schedule a call on my website. So
very nice. Very nice. Yeah, I'm sure our audience is going to love it. They're forward leaning. They're interested in granular detail. They're sorting through these things. And just one reminder to our audience then, there's lifestyle and non-drug tools for all of these things Dr. Shay invoked. And so folks should have that reassurance that the lights can come on, their suffering can be diminished, their enthusiasm and hope can genuinely increase just in response to, bringing these things into the light and giving themselves grace as they realize how their genetic story has affected what came before and what can be after. So really a blast today getting to talk with you, and I'm sure our audience, who I thank for joining us, is really going to love it.
Thank you for having me. As like I said, I'm so grateful for the podcast community and the ability to scale content that was just never available.
Absolutely.
Decades, and certainly even years ago.
We live in a neat time. Well, have a great day, Dr. Shay.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for the Seaworthy podcast. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. If you think we've earned it, please consider giving this podcast a like, subscribing, and giving us a 5-star rating on the platform of your choice. Thanks.